It's one of the most secretive and powerful organizations you've probably never heard of. The Bilderberg Group is hosting some of the world's top business and political leaders in Dresden. But how influential is it? And what does it say about the relationship between big business and politicians? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Folly Thibault. It's a forum held every year where the rich and the powerful can meet and exchange ideas in complete secrecy. Almost 130 politicians, bankers and industrialists are attending this year's Bilderberg Group conference in the German city of Dresden. This year's attendees include the former head of the CIA and the IMF's chief, but just like every year, no reporters are allowed in. There are no minutes of meetings, no votes and no policy statements. And participants are bound by what's known as the Chatham House rule, which allows people to make use of the information they've received, but not reveal the identity or affiliation of the person who gave it to them. Now, for years, the agenda and list of attendees of Bilderberg was kept a secret. A list of discussion topics is now released, but it's extremely vague. We do, however, have the full list of people attending. Two prime ministers will be there, Mark Rutte from the Netherlands and Belgium's Charles Michel. And as we mentioned earlier, Christine Lagarde is attending. She's the head of the International Monetary Fund. Two former intelligence chiefs, John Sowers of MI6 and David Petraeus, who used to lead the CIA, will also be there. And the rest of the list is littered with influential businessmen and bankers, including the heads of Shell, HSBC and Alphabet Inc., which is the holding company for Google. There are also around 10 journalists from major media organizations attending the meeting, but they can't report on it. Well, let's bring in our guest now. Joining us from Dresden on Skype is writer and journalist Charlie Skelton, who's covering the Bilderberg conference for the Guardian newspaper. In London, we have the head of global affairs at Oxfam, Katy, Wright. And from Middelburg in Holland, also on Skype, is Giles Smith, who's a professor of diplomatic history at the University of Leiden. Welcome to you all. Thank you for being on Inside Story. Charlie, in Dresden, if I can start with you, there are many people, of course, who don't know what Bilderberg is. So what actually happens when the world's most influential people get together?
I wish I knew. Well, it's hard to say, but what happens is that it's an intensive 3-day summit at which the participants will sit down and be part of an extremely rigorously structured conference, and some of these participants will be from the world of politics. So this year there are 2 prime ministers, 4 finance ministers, any number of other ministers from around Europe. There's Christine Lagarde from the head of the IMF. The list goes on of extremely influential policymakers, and what they're doing is they're attending a conference which is funded by and run by gigantic business interests. So this year, for example, it's Airbus, the 7th largest arms company in the world, and Deutsche Bank. They're the kind of host companies. Back when it was in the UK, Barclays was hosting it. So it's a corporate lobbying event, but it's a lobbying event that's so powerful that rather than meeting in the lobby of Parliament, say, the parliamentarians come to Bilderberg. Okay, well, let me bring in Giles Smith in Middelburg now. So a very vague agenda, Giles, at this meeting. No resolutions are proposed, no votes are taken, no final communique is issued. What's the point of all this? Why is this meeting still so important today?
Well, I think economic and political and financial elites always gain a lot from informally being able to discuss matters of current day interest. This is something that has occurred throughout history. So in that sense, there's nothing particularly new about it. I think there are obviously unique elements of Bilderberg, which perhaps we can discuss in the coming few minutes. But I don't think there's anything particularly unusual. I think the secrecy surrounding it, though, makes it more notorious. There's no doubt about that.
Yeah, well, as you know, the conspiracy theories abound around Bilderberg. I mean, everyone believes they're actually plotting world domination there, that this is a shadow government. And as you say, the secrecy doesn't exactly help this. How did these conspiracy theories start, actually? What led to people believing that there were other things going on here besides just informal discussions?
I think that it's quite straightforward, really. If you get such a tremendous group of powerful political and economic elites, and you've got them in one hotel, in also often a location that has been deliberately out of the way of the public eye. In the past, they used to often choose hotels in rather remote locations. Buxton in Derbyshire comes to mind, which is an unusual one. But if you do that, plus, as you've already mentioned, the agenda is somewhat vague. Plus, there's no media allowed in to actually report, and even the journalists who are invited as individuals are not allowed to write an op-ed on what they heard and what they saw. So that obviously combined is going to produce some pretty far-out stories about what they're doing, what they're achieving. Okay,
let me bring in Katy now in London. Katy, Giles says that, business leaders and politicians can gain a lot from a meeting in an informal setting. Do you agree with this? Do you think this is a good idea to get business leaders and politicians to talk about major issues without any oversight, any journalistic oversight, for instance?
Listen, I'm sure they do gain a lot, and there's nothing actually intrinsically wrong with people meeting and talking and discussing problems. But, what we've got to ask about a meeting like Bilderberg is who's not there. And that's most people affected by the issues that they're talking about. And this isn't about conspiracy theories. This isn't about secret plots for world domination. There's a pretty clear dominant elite out there. Oxfam put out a report earlier this year for Davos, another meeting that tends to be talked about in a similar vein, where we brought to light evidence that's available for everyone to find, which is that just 62 people in the world have the same wealth as the poorest half of the population, 3.5 billion people. And when you introduced this segment, you talked about the wealthy and the powerful meeting together, and increasingly it's that wealth and power come together. They are in fact in many cases just the same thing, and they're discussing problems, issues, global trends that have an effect on billions of other people who never get a look into those decisions. And that's actually why we see this kind of inequality that Oxfam cares about, and ultimately the poverty, continue.
Okay, well, I do want to talk about the selection process, about who is there and who's not there. And journalist John Ronson spoke to one Bilderberg founder, the former British Chancellor Denis Healey, who said, "We make a point of getting along younger politicians who are obviously rising, to bring them together with financiers and industrialists who offer them wise words." He says it increases the chance of having a sensible global policy. So, Charlie, about the people who are there, there have been, of course, theories that, Bilderberg builds future leaders, that, for instance, Margaret Thatcher's career launched after she attended the Bilderberg meeting, and so was Bill Clinton. He became president after attending the Bilderberg meeting as governor of Arkansas. Are these theories, is this true that they build future leaders, or is this just, coincidence, do you think?
Well, there certainly is a pattern, and some people would say they're good at talent spotting. Others would say that when a young or up-and-coming politician is brought into the fold of Bilderberg, then they're kind of joining a general consensus of power, and it doesn't exactly do their career any harm. There's perhaps the most interesting example of this, though, is you mentioned that the full list is published. Well, it's definitely not published, and I know this from long experience of finding out names that haven't been published on the list, and seeing, in fact, photographing people that I can see going in and who aren't on the list. But probably the most extraordinary version is in 2008, where Senator Obama and Hillary Clinton both attended secretly. And this was confirmed actually by, later on, in a French interview with the French Prime Minister, who confirmed that they were there. Now, this hasn't been publicized at all. What you can watch on YouTube is the entire press corps who was following Barack Obama around, suddenly realizing their presidential candidate had disappeared. And it's an extraordinary piece of footage. and I recommend you watching it. But what I would say is that absolutely there's a pattern, but you don't. Again, with a lot of these things, you don't have to immediately reach for the words conspiracy theory to describe them. So when you're describing, say, the global ambitions of the people at Bilderberg, you don't have to immediately shout conspiracy theory. You can just simply describe them as extremely powerful fans of globalization. They have absolutely got a global ambition, of course. Companies like HSBC and Royal Dutch Shell and BP, these are global companies who are big fans of, for example, TTIP. These are globalists. So yes, they absolutely do have a global ambition, and they have global reach and global power. I'm saying all of those things isn't to say it's a conspiracy theory. It's simply to describe a powerful set of business interests.
Okay, Giles in Middleburg, you mentioned that there were important gains that could be made out of these informal meetings. I just, for our viewers who are not familiar with the Bilderberg Group, just how influential is this group? And are they concrete examples of, of how they've changed or shifted global policy?
Yes, I mean, there are various ways of assessing influence, of course. One way to look at Bilderberg is a wonderful opportunity for informal channels of contact. An interesting one from history is when General de Gaulle was in charge in France in the 1960s and was directly challenging US leadership in the transatlantic region. There was a Bilderberg meeting planned, I believe it was in Cannes, in 1964, and one would expect de Gaulle to have cancelled it and dismissed it as yet another example of American power. But instead he let it go ahead, and not only that, he also allowed some of his key advisors to attend, because he understood that it gave him a wonderful kind of opportunity to test the waters of top American, British and other European officials on major transatlantic issues. In other words, he understood its value and its influence. There are other interesting examples. I think over time, Bilderberg has shifted from a more kind of politically orientated body, starting out in the 50s, which of course was a very intense era of building transatlantic institutions, NATO, etc., the early days of European integration. And I believe since the end of the Cold War, I do agree that it's become much more corporate orientated. Right. I think it's entered a kind of era of globalization where economic and financial deals are now merging with or even overseeing the political dimensions.
Right. And you wonder also if it's as influential as it was in 1954, when there's clearly a big pushback today against big business. I mean, Bernie Sanders in the US has based his entire campaign against this, big business and politicians getting together. Is the influence as big today as it was back in the 1950s?
I suppose the easy answer would be to say no, but that would probably be too simple. Because if you do follow that transition from kind of political institution building to corporate deal making, I think the corporate angle is extremely important, up there with Davos and other similar forums. And just to give one brief example, I think it's on record that Bilderberg in the late 90s was a key forum for the formation of what became Airbus. Okay. The original deals were made to merge the key Italian, German and French military-industrial concerns. So I think that's quite a recent example which shows what can be done.
Okay, Katy, so how worried then should we be that, our elected officials are having a summer camp, a get-together in Germany with people who clearly have big business interests in their minds, who are motivated by financial profits? How concerned should citizens, European citizens and of other countries, be about this? That, for instance, the finance ministers or the chief of the IMF is sitting down with oil executives and so on.
Yeah, I think they should be concerned. I think it should be concerned for a couple of reasons. I mean, it's not that we're saying that the idea of diplomacy and the fireside chat isn't useful between, essentially, as has just been explained, democratically elected leaders who we would presume to act in the public interest. But this is now very much about private interests, and those private interests are narrowing all the time, actually, as the nature of corporations narrows all the time to be completely focused on profit and shareholder interest. So the reasons we should be worried are twofold. Firstly, a lot of these companies will be lobbying for impacts that have great profitability for themselves, but very negative impacts for ordinary people. I'm thinking about big pharma industries who want obviously more and more profit for their drugs, pricing more and more people out of life-saving medicines. I'm thinking about another huge contribution to lobbying and to these kind of meetings, the finance industry, who've created, as we've seen, a financial sector that creates huge profits for those at the top and wreaks financial havoc for the rest of the world.
Okay.
And then the second...
Sure, go on.
Just the second reason why I think it's sort of structurally something to be concerned about is I'll take you back to this picture of inequality that Oxfam's facing, where the 1% own more than absolutely everyone else put together. And I think what that illustrates is just that people's conceptions about what the problems are in the world and what the solutions might be are of course going to be vastly different. And what meetings like Bilderberg and Davos and others do is they reinforce the idea that these are the experts, these are the people that know what's going on, they know the truth and they might know how to solve it. Well, that might be true for their truth and their problems, but they know absolutely nothing about the lives of ordinary people, whether they be in African villages or, deindustrialising towns in the UK. And those voices are just not getting heard in policy making.
Right, let's hear from Charlie in Dresden now. Charlie, the theme of the meeting this year is European unity, and I imagine that the upcoming UK referendum on the EU membership is going to be a very hot topic there. The Bilderberg chairman, Henry de Castries, told the Financial Times in January, and I quote, that a Brexit would be a disaster for the EU. So just how anxious are they about a possible Brexit in Dresden today?
I think they're genuinely extremely anxious because there's a lot at stake for these companies, particularly. Never mind the kind of Europhile politicians who are there. There are business interests for whom a Brexit would be, as Henri de Castries, who's on the board of HSBC and is head of AXA, it would be a disaster, absolutely, because apart from anything else, it would scupper the TTIP deal, just like that. And whether or not you're a fan of Brexit yourself, what you can identify is that a lot of the big banking and big business interests at Bilderberg have been very vocal about Brexit and about remaining in Europe, and have put their money where their mouth is. And Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, they've both funneled money into the Remain campaign. So
and how precisely, Charlie, just for our viewers, how precisely do they persuade governments to meet their interests? How do they do it?
Well, one would say at an event like this, because another way of there's lots of different ways of reading the participant list, and one way would be to identify the people in it who are part of extremely high-powered and influential lobbying groups, industrial or financial lobbying groups. So, for example, at this year's conference, there's the head of the BDI, which is the largest industrial German industrial lobby group, and there are, I think, 6 members maybe of the European Roundtable of Industrialists, which is a hugely influential lobbying group. So when we talk about lobbying, generally we are imagining it takes place kind of between executives of the company, focusing on parts of the policy, public policy they want affected. Whereas here, the lobbying is taking place at an extremely high level, almost so high you can't see it, because these are the very chairmen and CEOs of companies who are on the boards of the lobbying groups that do the lobbying. So, and it's an event which takes place for 3 days behind closed doors with no press oversight. So it's what we're describing, at least in one way, quite accurately, is a vast lobbying event.
Okay.
This is lobbying, corporate lobbying at the very, very highest level.
Giles, Charlie says, a Brexit would be a disaster for big business and banking. Do you see the Bilderberg Group having any influence whatsoever on the outcome of the referendum in the UK?
That's a very loaded question. And I will have to be careful what I say here, because I'd hate to be misquoted. Obviously, there are forms of influence which investigative journalists, historical researchers do their best to kind of tease out, to find out exactly how influential Bilderberg is in the public realm. But this is very, very difficult to pin down. But I do think because Bilderberg over the years has always invited journalists and public intellectuals to contribute to the internal debates, but not be open about the impact of those debates on their own thinking and their own kind of public statements afterwards, one has to assume that debates in the public realm will be in some shape or form influenced by the discussions going on in Bilderberg. Now, I do want to emphasize that that does not mean that the Bilderberg meetings are dictating the debates in the public realm, but it is inevitable that some of those sentiments and interests, and as Mr. Skelton has said, some of the lobby interests, are inevitably going to enter the public realm, and that Bilderberg is involved in that just the same way as other meeting groups like Davos, etc., are involved at the same time.
What about on issues like migration, Giles? Are they, where do they stand on the issue of migration in Europe right now?
Well, certainly there would be a great deal of concern. I mean, that's an interesting issue that will cut right across, I think, political and economic lines. You might see some interest feeling that this is an opportunity, others going more down the national security line. Mm-hmm. So, and others more kind of looking at the secondary damage to, say, kind of European Union as a functioning institution. So I think that's a very tough issue. It wouldn't surprise me if it's definitely on the agenda there for discussion.
Okay, Charlie in Dresden, let me just put a question to you now. Do you think this group today is still relevant, and do you think they should continue with these meetings? Do they bring anything? Do they add anything to the discussion on world politics?
In terms of its relevance, it's sometimes written off as sort of old men at the end of their careers meeting to play golf, which is an extremely dangerous misrepresentation of a meeting where, if you look at the participants, they're all the very heads of industries and banks. They're not old retired men. They are the chairmen and CEOs of giant industrial, media and financial institutions. So from their point of view, they're still at the very top of their game. They're still managing to attract, a vice president of the European Commission, a member of the executive board of the European Central Bank, etc., etc., two prime ministers, as I said. So they're doing pretty well. They're looking pretty healthy, and they're also, what they've done very interestingly is moved into the world of high tech. So on their board, you'll find people like Eric Schmidt, who's the head of Alphabet, which is the parent company of Google, and Peter Thiel, who's on the board of Facebook, who set up PayPal, and they're embracing such subjects as artificial intelligence and cybersecurity, and looking at those and bringing people into the fold who are from the high tech new media world. So they're adapting, they're changing, and they're still just as relevant as they ever were. Whether or not it benefits anyone else, I mean, they'd like to think it is, because if you look at in the UK, the Bilderberg functions as a charity. You look at they're called the Bilderberg Association, and this is a charity in inverted commas, which is funded by Goldman Sachs and BP.
Okay.
And the stated aim of it is public education, which is ironic since the public can't know what's going on there.
Let's hear from Katy now in London. Katy, you talked about this idea of an elite group that has nothing to do with normal people. So my question is very simple. Should government officials, elected officials who represent the people, be allowed to participate in such a conference?
Well, of course they should be allowed to talk to, a range of interests. Mm-hmm. The point is that they're doing that on a very different playing field, that this is the sort of meeting that is, has huge amounts of wealth behind it, and it does make the difference that these people are treated, to an all expenses paid weekend, that they're able to pay for direct and private access. I mean, it's also the meeting that garners a whole amount of attention. We're having this whole programme talking about these people, reinforcing the idea that this is where the important decisions are made. So it's not about blocking access for anybody, but it's about money being able to buy so much more access than other people can get who have perfectly legitimate ideas problems and experiences of the world. So it's about enforcing, who matters and who doesn't, and therefore increasing the inequality and poverty that we care about.
Well, thank you all for a very interesting discussion. It was good to hear your thoughts on this. Charlie, Skelton, Katy, Wright and Giles Scott-Smith, thank you for watching. And thank you as well for watching. You can always watch the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Folly, Thibault, and the whole team, thanks for watching. Bye for now.